Hello. I hope you're all well in self-isolation. This is a very strange recording I'm doing in my own bedroom. Um, I'm so gutted about his fest, but also really optimistic. So I hope you're well and having copious amounts of tea. Now I'm going to speak about something that I've been interested in for about maybe 10 years or so. Actually, it's probably since my childhood, actually, when I remember seeing on the family calendar um, a picture of Cordoba, the Mezquita, um, the famous, what we would call mosque cathedral in Spain. Um, and that image has always stuck in my head ever since. And it's a really magical place. And for me, ever since I've always kind of looked into what history has told us about what we now know as Al Andalus. So, what and where is Al Andalus? So, basically, Al Andalus is the Arabic name given to what is mostly present day Spain and Portugal together for kind of a brief but tiny period, maybe about 20 years. Um, this territory was also southern Spain, southern France, um, but this eventually kind of went back into kind of beyond back into the Pyrenees, and this territory was under Muslim rule, and it was ruled by Muslim leaders from about 710 um, up until popular cutoff point is the fall of Granada, which is 1492, when both the Jews and the Muslims were expelled. And Al Andalus was essentially, originally, it was part of the larger Islamic empire, but it kind of, after many generations, it created its own caliphate, and it was very distinct from the Syrian and the Arab uh, ruling classes during what essentially was a very long time. And I'll get on to how long that was, because how long did Al Andalus Islamic Spain last? Well, this might surprise a lot of people, and it still surprises me to this day, but Muslim rule in Spain lasted for a millennia. Yeah, well, just under a millennia, but there or thereabouts. Christian rule, or Christian dominance, as it were, does not even come close to matching that. Not yet, anyway. We're about halfway there. So Spain has been a Muslim country longer than it has been a Christian one. This issue is quite thorny in itself still. It's quite sensitive. And a lot of Spaniards nowadays, you ask them what their opinions are about this period of time of Islamic rule in Spain, and some people will say it was merely decorative. Others will say it was imposed on a Christian population. Neither of which are true. In terms of the timeline, one could say Al Andalus started with kind of the failed war in terms of the Islamic point of view with Charles Martel. You know, you had the Battle of Tours, you know, the Battle of Poitiers. Sorry, that's my English coming out. And it ended with Isabella expelling Jews and Muslims in 1492 to essentially create a monolingual, mono-ethnic idea of what a country should be, and that is what we have today in Europe. You know, these very distinct lines and borders. So Yeah, so that's essentially it in a crux of what Al Andalus was. But what makes it really distinct is how cosmopolitan it was. This was a really cosmopolitan society. And you have to think about the context of its day. Um, so, Jews, Christians, and Muslims created this kind of unique Andalusi culture. This was distinct from anywhere else, both in the Islamic Empire, in the Islamic world, or in Western Christendom. There's a myth that's often portrayed in a lot of paintings in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, where the Moors were painted as quite dark-skinned people, and the Reconquista Christians are white and blonde and blue-eyed. There is nothing to suggest that the Spanish Muslim population looked anything like that. Of course, they were there were Berbers, there were other North Africans, and within that there were Syrians and Arabs. But they comprised about 2% of the population. The majority were white, native Spanish Muslims. And in terms of, when you go deep, deep, deep into whether this was a cosmopolitan society, well, there were, you have to look at the way that, Jews and Christians of the youth in that time were, Arabic was the lingua franca of the day. They were writing their love letters in Arabic, and a lot of it was influenced by Islamic culture. So you have this fusion of Abrahamic religions kind of interacting together. You do also have to remember that Jews and Christians did have to pay tax to perform their faith, and this was called the jizya. But by and large, they weren't persecuted, and in the context of the rest of Europe, this society was as cosmopolitan as you could get for hundreds of years before the onset of modern migration in modern Europe. If you want a visual representation of how cosmopolitan this place was, there's a church north of Madrid, and you go there and it looks like a mosque, but it's not a mosque, it's a church. The inside is Arabic writing, there's calligraphy, there's very little iconography, and you do mistake it for a church, but it's Mudahar style. And what that means is it's a unique style which was inspired by Muslims, but Christians took it into their religious architecture. And this is almost a celebration of the culture that flourished and was shared between different communities. So now we have to think about who are the key figures in this kind of almost a millennia of history. But the first kind of major ruler was the Caliph Abd al-Malik, but he was beset by war and factions that were led by Berbers, by Syrians, by Arabs, and he couldn't really unify them. The first kind of unifying figure of Islamic Spain was a man called Abd al-Rahman I. This was a man, a prince, we should say, fleeing for his life from Syria, fleeing from the Abbasid rulers, who were a rival kind of royal family, a rival faction, who were set about exterminating the Umayyad family. And Abd al-Rahman was almost the last of his family. He ends up running from Syria, his homeland, all the way through North Africa, and he ends up in Spain, in modern day Spain. And through him, kind of Al-Andalus really kicks off. It really takes off. He introduces Syrian music. He introduces foods, culture. He builds the local Iberian culture and fuses it with all things Syrian. And you see that in the fruition of Cordoba. and the creation of the magnificent Mezquita. His grandson, Abdul Rahman III, really is in charge of the peak of the Golden Age. A lot of people call it the Golden Age of Islam in Europe. And this is when Cordoba was the seat of Europe's first academy of medicine, and it's a center of geographers, architects, craftsmen, artists, scholars of every kind. Cordoba rivaled the splendor of Baghdad. Um, Cordoba had lamps before Paris. Before this was a time when London was still essentially a village. Maybe not even a village. And this all came to an end. Uh, you know, it kind of comes to an end very sporadically, but Berber troops, essentially from modern day Morocco, um, who favoured a more austere form of Islam. They thought of the Spanish Muslims as quite decadent into their music and culture, and they ended up ransacking the cities of Cordoba and southern Spain, and essentially Christendom, the Castilians, they kind of slowly pick away. They pick away at Valencia, Toledo, vast waves of Portugal, and then we get to the hiatus of this tiny, tiny, tiny kingdom of Granada, led by the Nasrid family. Uh, the Kingdom of Granada is not the height of Islam in Spain. It's the last spark, it's the last hurrah, and it lasts 200 years up to 1492, or before 200 years, and then you get 1492 at the end. It's kind of the last candle in this darkness, and we see the remnants of it today in the Alhambra Palace. Go there, it's beautiful, it's stunning. You will fall in love with it. So, what was the lasting legacy of Al Andalus, Islamic Spain? Huge, absolutely huge. So, firstly, the Spanish Muslims and Islam in Spain led the translation movement of Greek literature and effectively transmitted, saved, and added to our understanding of Greek philosophy and science. So, the likes of Aristotle and Plato weren't only preserved, they were re energized and given new life. The universities of Paris and Oxford, they gained this knowledge centuries after the Muslims in Spain had taken this into their own hands and slowly travelled up north. Think about the figures of Averroes, Avicenna. Their real names are Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. We owe Al Andalus the beginnings of our understanding of optics and cameras, the introduction of oranges and fruits and rice into Europe. You see that in the paella dish. We owe them the legacy of the idea of gardens as public spaces, or looking into the heavens. The astrolabe, a device that Chaucer mentions in his texts, but that was made centuries before Chaucer. Imagine Korea inventing the Samsung smartphone, and it reaches the UK 300 years later, and it being the finest thing here. Can you imagine? It's incredible. We owe them Gothic architecture, so European in its identity, but we should give thanks to Al Andalus. The rib vaulting and buttresses, those ideas come from the trigonometry and the geometry of the incredible craftsmen from this era who were in conversation with Baghdad and beyond. We also owe them a love of books and educations and libraries. So much more we should give thanks to. And it's only with the creation of modern Europe and migration that, a lot of people are thinking about Al Andalus again. But we need to remember that Islamic Spain, Al Andalus, is as part of the European story as anything that comes after that, whether it's the Renaissance or the French Revolution, or all the royal history of Britain, or even World War II. Whatever it is, Al Andalus is as much part of the European story as any place else. So I hope you enjoyed that and you learned something new.